Welcome to Film Witch, a podcast, with me, Sandy Settle, practicing pagan witch and tarot reader for over a decade and a big fan of films. Here I talk about movies, their intersections with witchcraft and femininity, and whatever else I have on my mind, which is usually a lot. Blessed be, come in and sit for a spell. And please, rate and review me on Apple, follow me on YouTube and Spotify, and share it with someone you think might enjoy it. It helps way more than you might realize, and it means everything to me. Please consider joining my Patreon, which is the best thing you can do to help this podcast continue. You can also find me on Instagram and on Letterboxd at FilmWitchPod. You can send kind words, suggestions, and business inquiries to filmwitchpod@gmail.com. From 2012, Heidi is a recovering addict and radio DJ in Salem, Massachusetts. She's been clean and going to AA until a strange vinyl record shows up at work addressed to her, sent by a group known only as the Lords of Salem. When the record is played, it sends Heidi and other women of Salem into a trance. Its pulsating rhythm was long ago orchestrated by a 300-year-old coven of satanic witches hell-bent on manifesting the devil's offspring. And as the long-descended progeny of the witch-finder who executed them, Heidi is their perfect vessel. Hello, everybody. Here I am again. So I thought about trying to not bring this up, but I think that part of the whole impetus for me starting this podcast was to weave real life concerns and events into pop culture, at least as far as it pertains to me and pertains to a lot of people I know. Being a witchcraft practitioner as I am, it was always my goal when I first thought of doing this podcast to weave that into whatever I'm talking about, as well as the fact that I identify as a feminine person. I thought that was also something that I wanted to continually talk about in the context of whatever film I choose every episode. So I don't think it can be left out that living in the United States as I do, it's been rough. I am recording this in November of 2024. It's been a little over a week since the results of the election came clear to everyone, and it really could not be worse as far as what the result is currently. Trump is going to be president again, which to me personally is pretty unthinkable. It's a struggle to even talk about it. Also, the Senate has flipped, so Republicans are now the majority. They've also maintained a very slight edge in the House of Representatives. It ain't great. I know, we're here to talk about movies primarily, but like I was saying before, I can't talk about movies without contextualizing them in real life to some extent and my own experiences. So, I think if you're listening to this episode and me bringing up the election, for instance, or me potentially bringing up personal subjects in the future or world events or things like that, if that's something that you don't want to hear, you don't belong here with me and whoever does want to stay and listen. That stuff's going to be brought up continually. I think because, the podcast is relatively early on still, I just want to be clear about it right now, that's stuff that I'm going to bring up as far as it pertains to me and what I'm talking about. Pop culture is inextricably tied to what's going on in the world and what's going on in our lives. So I don't think you can divorce the two. And I'm going to, bring that stuff up when I feel like I want to and when I feel like it's necessary. So, if that's something that you're not interested in, then maybe this is not the podcast for you. And that is totally fine. And I wish you well, my friend. But yeah, it's going to be part of this podcast. So just wanted to mention that. I don't think I can record this episode without bringing it up because I meant to record this episode at the very beginning of the month. It's now about halfway. We're almost halfway through the month. And oh boy, you guys, I've been struggling. It's been really hard to do anything other than stare at one's phone in horror over all of this. I think if you're a practically minded person, this is obviously not good. It's not good for basically any marginalized community in the United States right now, whether you're a brown person, whether you're a member of the LGBTQ community, whether you're a feminine person. If you're not a white, straight man, you're, potentially in danger. We don't know how all that stuff's going to shake out yet, but it's been really difficult to think about other things, to do things that feel kind of frivolous or casual in light of the sort of terror one wants to lean into in a moment like this. But I will also say that I think it's okay to feel that way. It's also really important to push through that feeling and do something. Oftentimes it doesn't really matter what it is. For me, there are many things that help me stay grounded, and not the least of which because I have a 1.5-year-old toddler who demands meals, who demands naps, who demands playtime, regardless of how I'm feeling. And in a time like this, honestly, it's kind of a comfort, and it's really helpful to not get too in your own head and too selfish about your own feelings of despair or dismay. But another thing that you can do, and that's part of what I'm doing right now, is whatever you enjoy, right? And whatever you think might be enjoyable to other people. And so here I am recording my podcast, my new podcast that I'm only 4 episodes into. And I want to keep doing it, I enjoy it so far, and I can hopefully be a space where other people find enjoyment from what I'm doing. That's certainly my hope. And I want to create a little community space of my own here. Building communities of all kinds on the small level is something legitimate you can do in a time like this when you feel helpless and afraid. And there's all kinds of ways to do that. And I'm going to just do what I can to create communities of my own in my daily life, or build on the communities that I already have. So, I have to bring that up. It's so profoundly immediate as far as what's going on in the world right now. My hope is later when anybody listens to this episode that they'll be like, oh, it turned out okay. Oh man, I would love that to be the future, but nobody knows the future. So right now it feels pretty bad. But here I am, nevertheless. And today we are talking about Rob Zombie's The Lords of Salem, a film that I have loved for many years. And if anything, my love for it has grown over the years, which is really cool. Every time I watch it, I like it more and I appreciate it more. So if you've never seen this film, first of all, definitely recommend you watch it before you listen to this episode. It's my favorite thing he's done. I really love his Monsters movie. I know people derided that film a lot when it came out, but I think it's great. It's so much fun. It's so funny. It's just really, really enjoyable. I love the super bright neon colors and the production design for that film. It's just like a spooky fantasy. But this is probably my number one film that he's done. There's 2 of his films I haven't seen. I haven't seen The Devil's Rejects, and I haven't seen 3 from Hell. I have seen the rest. I've seen both his Halloween movies. I've seen 31. I'm probably forget. Oh, I've seen House of a Thousand Corpses, which I also love. I don't know if I can call it a good movie, but it's certainly an enjoyable movie in some ways to a certain set of us. But yeah, I think The Lords of Salem is all around his best film to date, for lots of reasons, and we're gonna get into that. Interesting thing about this movie, it came out in 2012, so in many ways I feel like it is a precursor to Robert Eggers' The Witch in some interesting ways. I don't know if anybody has ever, I couldn't find anything about this, so I don't have any proof, right? I'm curious if Eggers ever watched this movie, or if I'm sure Rob Zombie has seen The Witch. I'm curious how, he felt about watching that movie a couple years after his film came out, because there are some interesting parallels between the two. And most of them I know has to do with the fact that like a lot of that 17th century iconography is the same across the board, right? The goat being a symbol of Satan or of the devil, right? Those things are that's like old symbolism, old iconography from hundreds of years ago. So those things, as far as them being parallels in the two films, that's probably just, the commonality of the imagery. But yeah, it's funny because the film kind of opens almost immediately on a goat's head, and it strikes one very similarly as Black Phillip in The Witch. And I know I just did an episode about that movie, a really, really long episode, so long that the other half of it is on Patreon. But it's just interesting, right? There's some interesting parallels between the two films, and I think that would actually make a really good double feature. I would love to do a double feature of these two films together. I don't know if anybody's ever done that or ever seen the parallels the way I feel like I have, but speaking of the beginning of the film, this time around I rewatched it with Zombie's commentary, which is on the Blu-ray, and I think probably the DVD, definitely on the Blu-ray of this film. I have listened to Zombie's commentary for this film before, because like I said, I'm a big fan of this film, and I really have tried to do some research even in the past, just for fun. And his commentary for this film is like probably one of my favorite film commentaries I've ever listened to. It's just really, it gives some really interesting insight on the film. So we're going to go through some of the things that he talks about in that commentary, and a few other things, just things about him and other fun stuff that I found. But in that first part where they're showing the goat in the flashback scene, Zombie mentions that his name was Noodles, and contrary to Charlie the goat in The Witch, Zombie said that Noodles was very easy to work with. So maybe it depends on the goat that you get, right? Not all goats. Apparently Noodles was a cool, easy goat. It might have also had to do with the fact that Noodles is only in a couple scenes and Charlie is in a lot of scenes in The Witch. So I thought, maybe that's why Charlie was so difficult, because they had to use him so often. In any case, I thought that was funny. Rob Zombie immediately says that Noodles was an easy goat to work with, and Eggers has gone on the record many times talking about how Charlie was a nightmare. So, and Zombie actually brings up the fact that the dog that they worked with for this film, named Troy, and that is his real name, because originally Zombie was going to change it to something else, and he was like, why make this needlessly difficult by making the dog learn another name? So, the dog's, he's like a golden retriever. He's super cute. His real name is Troy, but Zombie does bring up the fact that he was more difficult to work with than the goat, actually, which is interesting. So one of the main characters in this film, besides Sherry Moon Zombie, Rob Zombie's wife, who plays Heidi, is Meg Foster, who plays Margaret Morgan. She is the head witch of the coven that was burned at the stake in the flashback scenes. She is so fantastic in this. She really commits to the bit. She's also in 31 of Zombie's other films, and she's pretty good in that one. That film is kind of functioning on a lower level than this one. I think they had a shorter shoot schedule for 31, if I remember correctly. So they just didn't have as much time. For this, I believe Zombie says they had a 22-day shooting schedule, which is not too bad. And Meg Foster is just incredible in this. She was apparently very comfortable with being naked for almost every scene in this film. She loved there's this little like kind of eldritch tentacle baby at the end that apparently Zombie says she just like loved it, fell in love with it. I think he said she called it Spawn Baby or something, where she was just like, sounds like she was a dream to work with and was just really giving it her all. And you can see in her performance, she's just committing to the bit. Just love her performance in this. Honestly, all the Coven of Witches and the three contemporary witches are so fantastic in this. They're all giving it everything, and we love to see it. We love to see it. I feel like there's a lot of influence, a lot of Black Sunday, Mario Bava's film, I think must have been a big influence on this film. Zombie doesn't bring it up in the commentary in so many words, but I feel like if you are a fan of Black Sunday or Roger Corman Poe movies or Hammer movies, you can see a lot of their influence on this film. And Zombie has mentioned other times, being a fan of those films and of that era of film. So I guess one of the things that comes to mind as a direct homage to those films is the iron mask that Margaret Morgan wears in the flashback scene of them being burnt at the stake. Zombie said that there were like some holes in it because they were going to like hammer nails into her face, kind of like the nails on the inside of the mask in Black Sunday. And then there's this incredible like Iron Maiden cage thing that their production designer made for this film. You can see it in that scene where I think Heidi's laying in bed, and behind her is like this sort of human-shaped wicker Iron Maiden cage that's like swinging back and forth. And Zombie says in the commentary that it was extremely heavy, and so he was super worried about it just like busting from its moorings and breaking or something, but they managed to get the shot without that happening. Anyway, it's a really cool piece of production design. I wonder, stuff like that, I always wonder like who has it now, like who owns that, whose like garage is that Iron Maiden in? Is it like in like Zombie's house somewhere? Like you wonder where that stuff goes. And I always wish I knew, where it is, who has it, whether it's being appreciated. But yeah, you can, stuff like those particular two things as part of the production design, I feel like are direct homages to like The Pit and the Pendulum or Black Sunday. Zombie doesn't say it, like I said, he doesn't, say those are direct homages. But to me, it's like, I don't know, you just can't watch a film like this and then like not think of those other films if you've done your homework as far as like, kind of gothic horror and things like that, and stuff that this is definitely more of a psychedelic horror film than a gothic horror film, but it has those kind of notes of like nodding to gothic horror films and other period horror films and things like that, since it is partially dealing with some period aspects. Zombie definitely brings up, in the commentary, though, that he was specifically going for a psychedelic vibe and atmosphere and a bunch of different psychedelic imagery, and that becomes apparent as the film goes on, for sure. So that was his primary subgenre, as far as like what kind of horror film. He specifically mentioned psychedelic horror being kind of what he was going for with this, which I think is quite obvious when you watch the film. So more interesting stuff that he kind of talks about in the commentary. He mentions that they were only in Salem for about 3 days. The rest of the film was shot in LA on a 22-day schedule. So, there are some really cool and obvious shots of Salem in this film. If you've been to Salem, they're pretty easy to recognize. But like, the scene where she's going to her AA meeting, it's obviously City Hall. With the town hall at the same building that they shot the party scene in Hocus Pocus, like the I Put a Spell on You scene, same building. So there's a few shots like that where if you've been to Salem, if you're familiar with Salem, you can obviously like spot the scenes that are actually in Salem versus the ones that were shot on like a soundstage in LA, or the interiors, which were pretty much all done in LA, according to the commentary. In the commentary, Zombie also says that he says that they were there in October, but then he kind of contradicts himself later in the commentary and says that while they were there, also, not only this point, but another one is that he mentions multiple times how cold it was in Salem when they were there. And then at another point in the commentary, he says they were putting up Christmas lights while they were there. So he must have gotten that mixed up, and they must have been there in November, is my guess, because if you've been to Salem in October, it's all Halloween all the time for the month of October there, and nobody's putting up any Christmas lights in October. So, yeah, it must have been November. Also, it's not super cold there yet in October. It's super cold in November, December, in October, the weather is pretty nice in Massachusetts still. So yeah, it must have been November when they were there. But it's, I mean, the Salem footage that they get for this film is really great, honestly. And they do a really good job. Zombie does a really good job of making you feel like you are in Salem. Like I said, if you've been there, or if you're from there or whatever, a lot of it is obvious, a lot of the important stuff, I think, that makes you feel kind of time and place. It's obviously Salem, and it feels very folly. It's great. They did a really good job with that. He mentions at another point in the commentary that if they had the money, he would have had this film set in the 70s. That's what he kind of wanted it to be, which would have been so cool. I mean, I'm really happy with, what they did with the contemporary setting, but you can kind of see nods to it every now and then. Kind of like the radio DJs even is more like a callback to something from, decades prior. But yeah, it's cool to think of the film, the version of this film that exists in a different timeline that's actually set in the 70s because Zombie actually got more money to make it and all of that. So, but it's cool that he even brings that up. As I was saying before, psychedelia or surrealism is a big theme in the film, and definitely what Zombie was kind of primarily focused on as far as the vibe or like the mood of the film. There's some really great production design things in this. There's that moon behind Heidi's bed that's based on that film, A Trip to the Moon by Georges Méliès. I do not speak French. But yeah, a pioneer of early film. There's this like beautiful mural of the moon from that movie, or that film rather, behind her bed, and it's just like such a cool image. Such a cool and interesting thing to look at, right? I think Zombie really excels at kind of like imagery that's like interesting to look at, right? Even if it's kind of like grotesque or like trashy or disgusting in some way. It kind of, I think it translates. I haven't been to one of his live shows, but I have been to, I have seen Alice Cooper, who is kind of similar to Zombie as far as his stage show and everything goes with the shock rock. Yeah, it's a, a whole mood. It's a whole vibe that you're going for with that. And I think it translates to his films, where he has like a very interesting point of view, a very interesting way of looking at things and making them interesting to look at. And I really like that about his films, honestly. Even if I don't really love all of his films, I really appreciate that about his film. I feel like he has a very distinct voice. Whether it's for you or not is totally up to you, but he's certainly not boring. There's some other really great production design stuff in this film that I just really appreciate, and I like it more every time I watch it. There's this wonderful kind of spooky Victorian-esque wallpaper all over the interior of the building that Heidi lives in. It's just something interesting to look at. It's something neat, and it gives everything kind of like this specific sensibility, right? Kind of a surrealism married with this kind of old school horror, hailing back to Hammer, hailing back to those Roger Corman, Vincent Price movies, hailing back to, those Bava movies. The production design of this movie was done by Jennifer Spence, and Zombie shouts out to her by name in the commentary, which is really cool. In the commentary, Zombie mentions that Heidi's apartment is specifically very orderly in the beginning of the film, that because she is a recovering addict, he wanted her to have kind of a very methodical and very calculated sense of orderliness in the beginning of her life, which is something that I think a lot of addicts can relate to, that desire and that effort to try to get one's life back in balance. And often that translates to the your living space, right? That you're like trying to refresh it. You're trying to maintain that sort of inner equilibrium from that outer sense of order. He said it's, something to notice in the film, because as the film goes on, obviously her apartment gets messier and more and more disarray. And specifically, he had that in mind. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but Zombie no longer does any drugs or drinks. I don't know if he would describe himself as straight edge, but that's basically kind of what he is now. So, I would say that to some extent, clearly, Zombie is drawing from his own experience, right? As far as like addiction goes or substance abuse specifically, right? He doesn't go into anything like that in the commentary, right? He hasn't spoken at length about his own kind of like road to recovery or his own struggles with addiction into too much detail. He's generally a pretty tight-lipped person when it comes to his personal life. He doesn't talk at length about himself very much and doesn't seem very comfortable talking about himself. But, the times that he has brought this subject up, he's mentioned that he no longer partakes of any drugs or drinks alcohol, and that they're, well, like I said, we'll kind of get into that later. But this is just my assumption, right, is that to some extent this sort of storyline of Heidi being a recovering addict is drawn from some personal experience to some extent. Something cool that I think is only really clear in the commentary, right, is like there are several people in the very small roles in this that are quite famous in their own right. Lisa Marie came in to be the woman who birthed the baby that Meg Foster spits on. There's like this scene where like a regular baby is born and they clearly wanted it to be like a satanic baby, and like Margaret Morgan's really angry and like spits on the baby, and it's a battery powered baby in that scene. By the way, no real babies were spat on in this film. But the lady giving birth to this baby is Lisa Marie, which you might know from several Tim Burton movies, and she and Tim Burton dated back in the day. But she plays Vampira in Ed Wood, and she's Ichabod's mother in Sleepy Hollow, among other things. She's in Mars Attacks and some of his other movies. But yeah, that's her only scene in this film. But she is in this movie, which I did not know prior to watching it with the commentary. Same deal with Barbara Crampton. Barbara Crampton is in this film for a hot second. You only see her face for like 1 minute, so I never noticed that it was her. But Zombie mentions her by name, thus we know that it is her. She's one of the women who are hypnotized by the record. A fair amount, I think it's worth mentioning now that I'm on this, a fair amount of the film seems to have been cut because it was just scenes that didn't end up being relevant to the final cut of the film or didn't work in some way. Zombie brings this up several times throughout the course of the commentary. Like, I did this scene and it had this in it, but we cut that out because it didn't end up working. It didn't end up fitting anywhere, stuff like that. He probably brings it up like at least 10 times during the course of this commentary. So it's clear that like kind of as the film was being made, they had to like quickly evolve a lot of things. I think part of it had to do with they had like a pretty small constrained budget, and they were on a timetable. That seems to have been true for pretty much all of Zombie's films thus far, that he scrounges up the money for it somehow. He figures out, some way to get a schedule that works for everybody, and he just shoots. Like, he's just like a DIY kind of guy, and I think that's really cool. But I would love it if somebody would give him like an actual big budget, and like I know he got a really weirdly big budget with House of a Thousand Corpses, which if I do an episode on that movie someday, we'll talk about that at that time. But I think for most of his films, it's proven true that like he's just like been severely constrained by like extraneous circumstances. And a movie like this, for instance, I would just love to see something like this, but with him getting a decent sized budget and like having like a little bit of a longer shooting schedule and like things like that, and less studio interference. I mean, doesn't every filmmaker want those things? But I would love to see it. Anyway, yeah, gone off subject there. But Barbara Crampton is in this film for a split second. She's one of the women who gets hypnotized when they start playing the record. And that's really... Zombie says that they're all in the audience at the end of the film in that theater. And that's the only other part of the film that the women who were in a trance for the record, they are in that last scene. But yeah, that's pretty much all the screen time they get in this. So he talks a lot about building the interior of the apartment building that Heidi lives in, which is not the interior of that exterior house. That exterior house is in Salem. The interior was, something that they built in LA. The church interior, same deal. The exterior shots are in actual Salem. That shot with the beautiful bridge and the cemetery, that's all in Salem. And the exterior of the church is in Salem. He said they couldn't get any church to shooting inside of a church interior because they would read the scripts and then be like, no way. So, they built that church interior. It sounds like they had to do it pretty quickly too. So it looks really good considering. In general, he talks, like I was saying before, he talks a lot in the commentary about just them having a pretty difficult shoot, it sounds like, in general for this film. Sounds like a lot of this, what was originally in the script, which I believe Zombie has released in book form. I don't know if it's been like edited from the original script, but I know that they did a novelization later, and I really want to get that actually. I ran out of time to get it, before recording this episode, but I know that exists. So probably a lot of the stuff that he had in the original script for this film is now in that novelization that he released. But I know a lot of it did not make it into the actual film due to like serious time constraints. He mentioned specifically that they just like straight up ran out of money at one point, and there was stuff that they were going to do and there was just no way to do it. There's like a scene in one of the flashbacks where Sid Haig is in. He's one of the guys that like is getting Margaret out of her Iron Maiden, her Wicker Maiden cage, and then putting her on her thing to be burned at the stake. And and Zombie goes into this thing about how him and the other guy were supposed to be brothers, and there was like this whole other like side story with them. But this is just stuff that like they were never able to shoot it. Like they ran out of money. Like it didn't end up happening. So I don't know if anybody has read the novelization of this and knows if that stuff is in the book, then you can comment and let me know. I am planning on reading it at some point because I really love this film. There's tons of scenes in this that are repurposed from other scenes, which is also really cool. It sounds like, they were just like trying to be as creative and inventive with like being able to use the same things over and over. So I know a lot of the rooms, there's like that room, the Heidi's apartment, and then there's like the room that the ladies hang out in downstairs, and everything just seems to have been like the same room that was redecorated over and over. So that's cool. I mean, they really do. You would never know it to watch this movie, honestly. Like I would never have guessed that these are a lot of the same interiors, just redecorated. They do, the production design just is really, really, really great in this movie. Jennifer Spence, production designer for this film. Back to the kind of surrealism aspect that Zombie emphasizes was a big part of his vision for the film. In the first scene, we see Heidi riding in a car, and there's a very kind of surreal, almost dreamlike aspect to it. Zombie specifically mentions that in that opener, he wanted to kind of make the audience have this sense or establish this mood, questioning whether what we're seeing is really happening or not, right? Whether this is like some kind of like drug trip that Heidi is having, or if this is like her having a dream, right? We're supposed to be unsure of these things. And I think, that kind of carries throughout the entirety of the film. We're really never sure if this is like related to her drug use or if this is something that she's actually experiencing, right? And we're not given an answer regarding that. You could very much see this as, an illusion brought on by drug use or something like that. And it could just be, if you wanted to take the film that way, as this is all in her mind, Zombie leaves that open to interpretation. And it seems like that was purposeful on his part. Like he wanted you to question that. I think it works really well because when you are an addict, right, you really begin to lose your tether on reality a lot of the time. You're in a constantly kind of like heightened or an altered state, right? So your perception of reality is usually inaccurate in that state. And if you're always high or drunk or whatever, then your perception of reality is always altered. So I think that it's just a kind of I really love it as a recovering addict myself. It's a really effective way of framing this, and you can interpret the film in many different ways because of it. I just think it's really well done, and I think that people who deride this film, maybe they're just not. It's like with that old anecdote of people like, oh, if you don't like this, you just haven't watched it enough times, But I really think this is one of those films. Like, if you ask me, I really think this is one of those films that it gets better the more you watch it. The text becomes richer, right? And at first, it's like this really campy, over the top, satanic, extreme kind of like horror thing. But like I said, there's kind of these layers to this film, and there's this really interesting subtext, honestly, that I feel like a lot of people maybe ignore about this film, or they don't bother to kind of, think a little more deeply about what Zombie is exploring in this particular film of his. So I just wanted to shout out the 3 contemporary witches in this film, played by Patricia Quinn, Dee Wallace, and Judy Geeson. Patricia Quinn and Dee Wallace are noteworthy. Patricia Quinn was in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's probably the film she's most well known for being in. And then Dee Wallace is the mom in E.T., which is probably her most famous role. It's great to see them in a film like this. They're just really getting to play, I think, something that's probably really exciting for a lot of people in Hollywood, a lot of older women specifically in Hollywood. And Zombie specifically mentions them being like so excited to get these roles and to play them the way that they do. I'm sure they talked to him several times about the fact that when you're an older woman in Hollywood, you get like nice mom roles or nice grandma roles after a certain point, and you don't really get anything else. So when you get a role like this, that's like Satanic Witches, it's like exciting and fun. I can imagine, if that were my profession, that I would be so thrilled to get a role like this personally. And it seems like they had a great time. He mentions that they some of them did not quite get along sometimes, but he says he brings it up in a very good-natured way. Like, he was like, it didn't matter to me, we were shooting a film and people get on people's nerves sometimes, that kind of thing, and he was just kind of like, by the end of the shoot, everybody was fine, and people got along fine. And it seems like it was just like something that he didn't let it bother him. And so I thought that was cool, because to me, it was kind of this indication of like, if you're the person who's directing the film, right, if you're guiding the ship, if you're like, hey, let's just move on, let's not make a big deal out of this, it kind of sets the tone, I think, for everybody else on set. And if you're not letting it derail the day, that other people are less inclined to try to let it derail their day. So I just thought like the way that he brings it up was, like I said, good-natured, and he just doesn't like kind of like point the finger at anyone specific, he just kind of was like, sometimes they were bickering, like he's like, but I didn't care, like that, So it's clear that like he remembers there being like some kind of friction on set, but like just he refused to let it like derail his film. So I think interesting thing that a particular thing I really liked about the commentary, and I think helps clarify a bit, because there are several like scenes in this film where like you're kind of like, everything's left very ambiguous and surreal, like I said. So things, we do not get explanations for things. This is like the opposite of an exposition film, right? Where like you're going to just have to make something up as far as what the heck that means, right? Which I really like personally in films. I know some people don't like that. They want things to be spelled out for them. They want to have like a clear understanding of like, the nuances of characters and things like that. But that's not what Zombie was going for with this film. Like I said, the surrealism, the imagery was definitely at the forefront of his mind, and as far as like what he was trying to make. But there's several different, evil specters and things like that in this film, and you're never really like 100% sure like who is whom, and there's like this implied like kind of satanic aspect, so there's like a Satan figure somewhere in here, but you don't know like who exactly out of all these people is supposed to be the satanic figure. But Zombie clarifies that in the commentary, and it's supposed to be the little guy, the little like tentacle arm guy in the Golden Theater. I believe it's a theater in LA that they shot that in, but he is supposed to be Satan. This is never stated outright in the text, so you kind of have to like intuit that is Satan, and that when Heidi goes in there with her like white face makeup and grabs his little tentacle things and then like shakes them around, that he's like impregnating her somehow through her hands, that's what Zombie says that scene is supposed to be, right? I think it is quite ambiguous, right? It's not explicit what's going on there, but yeah, that little guy, that's Satan, which I think is quite fun, to be honest with you. Just a weird, interesting, fun, and funny interpretation of the satanic figure. Zombie specifically mentions, at the end of the film that Heidi is like kind of the Virgin Mary of hell, right? This scene at the end is supposed to be kind of like implying that they're in hell, perhaps. And that's similar to Rosemary's Baby, which I rewatched with my husband over Halloween. That at the end of the film, it's kind of implied that Rosemary is kind of like this Virgin Mary figure, this bastardized Virgin Mary figure, right? That she is the mother of the Antichrist, right? Versus the mother of Christ. So same deal with Heidi at the end of the film, that's kind of like the figure that she has become. In any case, I think, there's just so many things I love about this film production wise. I think it's definitely like almost a camp vibe sometimes. I love the surrealism and the psychedelia of the film, just like very striking imagery, very memorable, and certainly something different, right? I think at the very least, even if you don't like this film, I think you have to admit that this is just its own thing, and it's definitely unique at the very least. So, and like it's just very striking. Like just he makes a lot of really interesting, fun choices in this. And he, I loved this. He describes this film in this was an interview, I believe. I don't think this was in the commentary, but he described this film as if Ken Russell directed The Shining. My husband and I also watched Ken Russell's film Gothic over Halloween, and we were like, what? We were just like, this fucking movie, like the boobs with the eyeballs in them, and like just I thought that was a really that specific film of Ken Russell's. I don't know what Zombie would say about this, but I think that was a specifically apt comparison to The Lords of Salem, just because it's kind of like a drug trip movie. They're all like drinking a bunch of laudanum and stuff, and so they're all just like fucked up in that movie, and it's causing them to have like crazy hallucinations and to like behave in like a completely unhinged, erratic way. And one interpretation of The Lords of Salem could be that because Heidi is off the wagon, right, that she starts using again in the film, that all of this is kind of like her having a bad trip, right? That's certainly an interpretation that you could decide, is what the film is doing and what it's talking about. That's one interpretation. So I think I just loved that description from him, if Ken Russell directed The Shining. And I think that's part of the reason why I love this movie so much, because I am definitely a big Ken Russell fan. I like The Shining. I don't love it. But yeah, this is like my version of The Shining. This is my preferred Shining. This is Rob Zombie's Lords of Salem, if that tells you anything about me. Zombie is a divisive filmmaker, to say the least. I have come across people who absolutely hate his films. I have come across people who are devout fans of his films. Rarely do you find somebody who is like, they're just okay, right? I think that I lean more on the side of I like his films. Some of them I love, right? I'm not like a huge super fan, but I am definitely a fan of some of his films, this being at the forefront. I am also a big fan of Halloween 2. I am one of those people. I'm a Halloween 2 apologist. I don't really care for the first one. However, I've only ever seen the director's cut of that film, and there is a SA scene in that film that I really hate and think is horrible. And I say shame on you, Zombie, for that particular scene. But I am a fan of his work. So, yeah, that's one of my biggest criticisms of him as far as like his work goes, that in that particular cut of that particular film, I think there's some really egregious stuff that shouldn't be in there. But yeah, I definitely am a fan of him in general. And I love that Monsters movie, and I love this movie, and I think Halloween 2 is really cool and different and interesting. So interesting stuff about Zombie personally. His Wikipedia has actually got quite a bit of stuff in it, which is cool. Somebody did some good work there. But as far as what I, researched and what I know about him is he was born in a small town in Massachusetts. His parents were both carnival workers. And we're talking like carny workers. We're not talking about like some kind of like fancy upscale thing. We're talking about like rednecks. And it seems to have had a profound impact on him from a really young age. He's mentioned before watching a lot of TV when he was growing up, and having some pretty like dark experiences, of specifically like witnessing some dark things when he was a kid. I don't think these things, were things that happened to him personally so much as he witnessed some dark things, right? He mentions at one point that his parents decided that they wanted to get out of the carnival business after there was like a big riot on the carnival grounds over, I think it was some kind of like wage dispute, something like that. But he saw like a man get like smashed in the face with a hammer, and this was when he was a really little kid. I think he mentioned before, like, there's just like other stuff he saw as a kid that just seems to have like kind of messed with him pretty badly at an impressionable age. And I think a lot of that translates to his films when you watch them, having to grow up around like a certain subset of disenfranchised people, definitely seems to have had a profound effect on him. And, to this day, it seems like within the context of his art, he's working through the trauma of some of that, which is just really interesting. And I think reflects a lot, on what he's interested in and what kind of art he makes and things like that. Of course, he's very well known for being in the metal band White Zombie in the 90s. They weren't really around for that long. But as far as like the landscape of music, goes, they were together for a relatively brief amount of time. He dated one of the members. I'm no expert on White Zombie, but I know that he dated one of the other band members for a long time. I think they were together before the band was even formed, and broke up after they had been together for a long time, but still tried to keep the band together, kind of like a Fleetwood Mac situation or something. But it sounds like that the band dissolved pretty quickly after that. And I know he met Sherry around the same time. And I believe they got married in Vegas, which is cute. And they have been together ever since. I believe they got married in 2002. So they've been together for a really long time. From all accounts, Zombie is a wife guy for sure, which I love. He loves to have his wife in his movies. He has said, that she photographs well and things like that. Like he definitely likes to look at his wife, through the context of film and things like that. So, I just think that they have a really sweet relationship. And I think a lot of people are fans of just their relationship in general, outside of, the films that he makes or anything like that. Both he and Sherry are ethical vegans, which is really awesome. And they have a house in LA, but they also have a farm that they bought in Connecticut. This is something I did not know, which I love so much. And on this farm, they rescue neglected farm animals and take care of them. It's just like the most wholesome thing. You watch like House of a Thousand Corpses, and in your mind, you're not like, this is a guy who like has a farm in Connecticut and takes care of rescued farm animals. Like it's not but nevertheless, these two nuances exist in the same person, which is really awesome. But yeah. Like I was saying before, Zombie is pretty averse to talking about himself personally very much. We get like, a few sound bites like every 10 years about like some aspect of his personal life or about his history or something. But, from what he has said, as far as his religious beliefs, it sounds like he's probably an atheist or an agnostic. He said before that he thinks, this is all there is kind of thing as far as his religious beliefs go. Like I was saying before, he also has brought up a couple times very briefly the fact that he no longer doesn't eat drugs or drinks alcohol. And a quote from him, I believe this is on Wikipedia, he says, "I certainly didn't achieve anything by being wasted and fucked up." So can relate to that. I also did not achieve anything by being wasted and fucked up. And my life has been much, 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 much better than I could have ever imagined since I got sober a few years ago. So yeah, can relate in a big way to that. But yeah, sounds like I've always thought, he sounds like a cool guy outside of this crazy, redneck horror stuff that he does. He seems like he's actually quite healthy person now in his personal life. I am hoping to eventually see his live show because, like I said, I've never seen that before. Oh, an interesting thing and cool thing on his Wikipedia that I didn't know before. I think I had heard briefly that he was responsible for designing one of the first haunted attractions for Universal, their haunted horror nights, which is a really big thing now that they do every year that has like all these themed rooms, and it's like a huge deal. And, it's like you get your tickets way in advance and people wait in line for hours for this thing. But he was responsible for one of like the first really successful haunted attractions for Universal in 1999. This was probably right around the time that he got the funding to do House of a Thousand Corpses. But later, this attraction that he designed was deemed instrumental in reviving the Halloween Horror Nights. I guess they had done it prior to then. Maybe it wasn't doing as well anymore. So according to Wikipedia, he had a big hand in reviving anybody who is into Halloween stuff now knows how big Halloween Horror Nights has gotten over the past decade. So yeah, I guess he was a really big part of that, as far as the revival of that being a big deal. As far as anything else I have to say about this film, I just want to reiterate that it's definitely my favorite film of his. I get something new out of it every time I watch it. I think it's super interesting. It's super well made, especially considering the budget constraints and the time constraints that they had for this film, I think it's much better than films that are like have twice the budget and twice as much time, and more well-known casts and all that stuff. This is just something special. And if you're into horror, if you're into surreal horror or psychedelic horror specifically, this is definitely a film for you. Even if you're not, if you liked movies like The Witch, for instance, I think that there's something here for you, as far as like just like interesting subtext, kind of like that old-timey horror elements, some folk horror elements in addition to the surrealism. There's just like really great production design and really interesting imagery and some really cool fun stuff for the female characters in this film. It's pretty much primarily women in this film. There's a couple male characters, but not very many. It's mostly women. So that's a cool thing about this film also. So yeah, I don't know. If you're a horror fan and you haven't seen this, I can't recommend it highly enough. Definitely, I think there's something here for you. And it's definitely a film that I continually enjoy revisiting. And I have been saying, I feel like I get something new out of this every time I notice something new. And highly recommend the commentary if you haven't watched it with that. Man, that's something about physical media, right, that I think can't be replaced. Maybe if they started, like if you buy a film, a digital version of a film, if they started like including commentaries again, I wish they would start doing that. But a big reason to get physical media, among all the other reasons that it's great, is that you just don't get audio commentaries on any other format really for a film, and there's, if you're interested in film, if you're interested in the art form, I can't tell you how great it is to listen to a filmmaker talk about their film, like as they're watching it, right? And to give you like all these little anecdotes and all these interesting facts and all this information and all this insight as far as like how this film came out this way and what it's about and what they were trying to do and what they were thinking about and what they were interested in and what inspired them. It's like really invaluable, honestly. So yeah, if you if you're still one of those people who like hasn't gotten into physical media because you're pretty young and, you know, you weren't around back when they were like doing DVDs and everything, you know, it's if you're interested in film, this is really worth looking into as far as like finding your favorite films on physical media and seeking out the audio commentaries by the filmmakers on those discs. That's one of the best things I think about, you know, like a boutique creator like Criterion, that they're doing like so much supplementals for those films. That's a big draw for those editions of those films that they do. And thankfully on their platform, you know, they will release like all of that stuff digitally on their app. But a lot of other apps are not doing that. So they're really the outlier when it comes to that. But yeah, if you've seen this film and you like it and you're a fan of it, but you haven't watched it with the commentary, you know, go online on eBay and find a copy of the DVD or whatever so you can listen to it, because it just enriches the experience so much. I really can't I can't recommend, you know, experiencing the film with his commentary enough for this specific one. It's one of my favorite commentaries ever. So as usual, I am going to give y'all a spell that pertains to this film in some way. So this spell, I thought about this one a lot before I wrote it out and came up with it, because there is a personal aspect to this film for me, you know, as far as like what would be a useful spell or a helpful spell that pertains to some of the subject matter in this film. And I'm sure I will talk about this more in different episodes as we get further on into the podcast and we talk about other different films and their subject matter. But I am a recovering alcoholic. A few years back in 2018, my alcoholism had begun to get particularly bad, and I was spiraling pretty heavily into serious addiction. I was in a relationship that was making me really unhappy, and I had been in that relationship for a really long time, so it was hard for me to even think of leaving it, you know, but nevertheless, I was super unhappy in the context of that partnership. And so I was trying to kind of, you know, stem the bleeding by drinking a lot. And I started to drink by myself a lot, you know, and that's kind of like the slippery slope into alcoholism. A lot of people can relate, I'm sure, to, you know, the difference between like having a drink once a week socially and then like drinking by yourself every night, which is what started to happen to me. And I decided that I didn't want to live that way anymore, and I broke up with my ex and I stopped drinking, and I have been sober ever since, thank goddess. And but I can relate a lot to, you know, that fear of spiraling back into my addiction. I always say that you are never not an addict, right? It doesn't matter how long you've been sober. You are always, always, always an addict. And the minute you forget that, I think, is the minute that you're in danger of falling back into your addiction, right? If you think that you've beaten it. Because I think it's important to, as a addictive person, as a person who has substance abuse issues in my past, you know, I think it's important to continually acknowledge that there's this part of you that is never satisfied in that way, right? That the minute that you start, it's always more, right? So it's better to remind yourself of that, to keep in mind that you cannot ever start again, right? But I know that the path to recovery is often quite long and fraught with difficulty for a lot of people. And I think that because of that knowledge that I'm always going to be an addict, even if I haven't had anything to drink for years, which is the situation that I'm in right now, I think I would never believe for a second that I wouldn't accidentally fall back into my addiction, you know, that it's always a possibility. And so a way to help myself with that is to be mindful of that. And a way to not let that happen, right, is to be mindful that that could always happen if I forget that there's this part of me that always wants a drink. So the spell that I came up with today is quite personal in that way, right? And it also pertains to what this film is kind of exploring. And the spell is to aid in conquering addiction. So write out the addiction that you're working on conquering on a piece of paper. Use a pencil for this because we're putting the paper in some water in a minute. Fold the paper up 6 times. Doesn't matter how you fold it, just make sure it's 6 times. And this is the principle of 3 times 3 that a lot of us practitioners use. So in a cup of water, add 1 teaspoon of salt, add the folded paper, add a clear quartz stone. Doesn't matter what size it is. A small one's probably best, but whatever you got is fine. You can just stick it right in there. And a smoky quartz as well. Make sure that the stones are clean. Wash them off with some soap and water before you put them in something that you're about to drink, because you don't know where those have been. So after you do this, recite, "For the fulfillment of my destiny, clear away this obstacle of the mind. Henceforth may I be free, and leave the burdens of the past behind. So mote it be." And you just can say this one time. Gargle with the salt water after this. So put some in your mouth and then swish it around, basically. I would recommend about 15 seconds. You can do it longer than that if you want, but yeah, I would try 15 seconds. Try to have it in there for a little bit. And then spit it out into a sink. Pour out the rest and watch the water drain away. And for extra potency, you can bury that wet paper in the ground. I would recommend a safe place that will remain undisturbed. Something, if it's in your backyard, make sure it's off in a corner somewhere that nobody's going to mess with it, or bury it by some tree roots where nothing's going to get into it. Just bury it somewhere that, nobody's going to touch it, basically, because you want it to remain buried. So the last note that I want to make about the spell, and about kind of my intention with it and my hope for the intention of anybody who would be working the spell, is it's important to understand that one must have a personal desire, a personal will to remain sober, or to be sober, or to attain sobriety, right? Without that personal desire, sustained sobriety is basically impossible. So unless you personally feel like you want to be done with it, that you are sick of it, that you don't want to live that way, that you don't want to behave that way, and you don't want to enact that pain on the people around you anymore, unless you feel that way with conviction, it's going to be really hard to maintain your sobriety. So, it requires this kind of will of the mind, right? It requires this personal will brought out of the self to maintain sobriety. So, I want to emphasize that no spell could cure your addiction for you. No single person can help you out of your addiction, right? Except for yourself, right? These other things are tools that help us after we achieve that personal sense of wanting to be sober, right? That's why, people go to rehab, but then they relapse when they come out because they didn't have that strong personal conviction that they didn't want to take the substances anymore, right? That they didn't want to do all of the things that go along with the substance. So until you kind of have the personal desire to get sober, none of this other stuff is really going to do anything. So when you feel like you've gotten to the point where you want to be sober, right, these other things can be helpful, right? The spell that I just talked about, going to rehab, being in a clean environment around people who are not users, stuff like that can actually help you maintain your sobriety. But until you get to that point where you feel like you don't want it in your life anymore with a strong personal conviction, it's hard to rely on anything else to do that for you. That's just hard work that we each have to do personally. And on that note, as above, so below, and peace out. Until next time. This podcast is produced by David Settle. He also made the music.